Access Minnesota. Issues that matter to you. Access Minnesota brings you the newsmakers and the stories that shape our everyday lives, with analysis from University of Minnesota faculty experts. Now, here's Jim Dubois.
One of Minnesota's most valued resources are our lakes, rivers, and streams. But those waters are increasingly threatened by aquatic invasive species, living things that are not native to our state. Aquatic invasive species include fishes, plants, invertebrates, and microbes, and can harm our health, environment, and our economy. The University of Minnesota's Aquatic Invasive Species Research Center has identified roughly 36 such species. This month on Access Minnesota, we look at a program through the University of Minnesota that trains citizen scientists to help monitor aquatic invasive species. We'll learn how these citizens are providing researchers with the necessary data to combat the spread of these harmful animals and plants. Megan Weber is an extension educator at the University of Minnesota's Aquatic Invasive Species Research Center. Megan, welcome to Access Minnesota.
Hi, thank you.
First of all, Megan, what exactly is an invasive species?
So an invasive species is like a plant or animal or even a pathogen that comes from someplace outside of the United States or even outside of our region. And it's typically something that causes harm to, say, like human health or the environment or the economy in some way.
Tell us about some of the aquatic invasive species that inhabit Minnesota.
Sure. So some of the more famous species would, of course, be something like the zebra mussel. And that's a mollusk, so it has shells. It's related to like snails or some of the native mussels that we have in Minnesota. We found that in Minnesota in the 1980s, and they've been finding it in lakes kind of steadily as the years go by. It's a species that tends to filter out like plankton and such from the water, and it can impact the food webs of the lakes that it gets into. It's also sharp, so it can cut your feet. I'm sure people are pretty well familiar with the impacts of zebra mussels who enjoy lakes in Minnesota. We have other invasive species in the plants realm, so Eurasian water milfoil. One of our newest invaders is starry stonewort, which is actually an algae, and that's been found in, I believe the count is up to 9 lakes in Minnesota so far. And yeah.
How do these aquatic invasive species find their way into Minnesota's waters?
So it depends on the species. There's a few different ways that they can transport. Some, for example, zebra mussels will come across attached to like a boat, or they have a microscopic life stage called a veliger that can be free floating in water. So if you dump a bait bucket or a live well into a new lake, those can transport that way. Plants can attach onto like a hitch or something else as you're moving from one lake to another. And let's see. You can also get people who are well-intentioned as they're trying to maybe release a pet that they don't want anymore, or they have an aquarium that might have some live plants in it that they're done with, and they think the best thing to do is to dump that into a lake or river or pond. And that's another way that can actually spread invasive species.
What are some of the most problematic aquatic invasive species that we have in Minnesota waters?
So Minnesota DNR maintains a list, that's our infested waters list, and those are typically the species that they find to be kind of on that most dangerous list. Those are usually what they call prohibited invasive species. So some examples of species that are on that list would be like zebra and quagga mussels, Eurasian water milfoil, what else? Starry stonewort is on that list now. So, and that list is available on DNR's website as well.
Where are these aquatic invasive species typically found? Are there particular areas and waters in the state that are susceptible to them?
So you can find, an invasive species can find its way into any water body, and some of the things that limit depend on that species. So for example, sometimes zebra mussels are not found so much in lakes that have lower levels of calcium or aren't able to survive as much, but there's other invasive species that might be able to find there. Higher risk lakes in general tend to be lakes that have the most traffic of like recreational boating.
What damage do these species do to our environment?
Yeah, so it depends on the species. They can do anything from altering the food web. So for example, like I mentioned with zebra mussels, that filter out kind of the plankton and that base of the food web. They can have kind of direct impacts. So there's invaders like rusty crayfish, and they can be fairly aggressive, so they can actually outcompete some of the native crayfish. And you can get plants that become real dense monocultures, so they change the makeup of a variety of plants in the water that provide refuge and a variety of different habitats into kind of a very dense plot of plants.
How quickly are the aquatic invasive species spreading throughout Minnesota?
That's a good question. It depends on the species is really the answer, and it depends on the year. So there's years where maybe you'll see 1 or 2 new zebra mussel lakes, or last year we had a number of new starry stonewort lakes. So it's really variable on the species and what's going on.
When Access Minnesota returns, how you can help in the fight against aquatic invasive species in our state.
Access Minnesota will return after these messages. You're watching Access Minnesota. Here's Jim Dubois.
Registration is now open for aquatic invasive species detectors across Minnesota. Those interested in helping combat aquatic invasive species should visit www.mais.usmn.edu/AIS-detector. Now more on the detector program with Minnesota Aquatic Invasive Species Research Center's Extension Educator, Megan Weber. You're an extension educator for the program that trains citizens to monitor aquatic invasive species populations. Tell us more about this program, how it got started, and how do you go about recruiting these citizen scientists?
Yeah, so the AIS Detectors program got started through a grant that was submitted through the state of Minnesota. It comes from the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund money. And the idea was to create a statewide network of volunteer monitors. There isn't anything as of now that's a statewide effort. There's lots of great local efforts, but nothing that's concerted. And some of the great things that the vision was to do with this program was to provide an extra arm to DNR where they can reach out to this network of people who are trained on how to identify invasive species and use them to help weed out reports and help them focus on some of the more high priority tasks that they have on their desks. And some of the other things that they can do is search lakes for new invasive species that are found there. One of the best ways to kind of have a chance at preventing a species from becoming established is early detection. So having a large network of people out there to look is a great way to help our state. And they can also help with education and outreach and helping spread knowledge about invasive species and how they can prevent them and identify them to other Minnesotans.
How many monitors are currently involved in the program?
So the program is just launching this year. So we're training our first set. There's 7 workshops set up for around the state, and there's room for 25 participants in each workshop.
There is a detector program and a tracker program. What's the difference between the two programs?
Yeah, so the detectors program is really that first detection type program. The AIS Trackers program is a little bit different, where participants are able to help us monitor lakes that have done some kind of treatment for an invasive species. That program monitors 3 species in particular: Eurasian water milfoil, curly-leaf pondweed, and zebra mussels. And especially the 2 plants, curly-leaf pondweed and Eurasian water milfoil, make up 94% of the permits that are issued by DNR, at least in 2015, for treatments for invasive species. And the hope is that we can collect data about the water chemistry, how successful the treatment was, any impacts to non-target species, and be able to build this database that'll give us better information about when and how to use various control tools.
What sort of qualifications do you look for in people who want to become an aquatic invasive species detector or tracker?
Someone who is excited about getting outside and helping to protect Minnesota resources. You need to be at least 18 and be interested and want to improve things, I guess. You would need to be able to access a computer. There is an online training component, and it's fine if that's at your local library. You don't have to have your own. And same if you're going to report new invasive species, we teach you how to do that using a tool called EdMaps. And you can visit that website. It's www.edmaps.org/Midwest. And that can be done online as well, and that's the tool that we use to report any new invasive species. But other than that, we just are looking for anyone who's excited to learn more and wants to get outside and get involved.
So does the online program then train volunteers to be able to identify aquatic invasive species?
It does, yep. You learn on the online program, you get to learn a bunch about how to do identification of aquatic invasive species. So there's 3 different categories that you'll have. We teach you about a group of plants, a group of invertebrates, and a group of fish. And on top of the identification knowledge, you learn more about what the rules and regulations are in Minnesota surrounding aquatic invasive species. You learn about how to prevent the spread of invasive species, and you can learn more about general aquatic ecology and how AIS impact Minnesota and the United States in general as well.
Megan, tell us more about the one-day training session that volunteers undertake.
Sure. So all the volunteers, after they do their online training, attend a one-day in-person workshop. And at those workshops, they get a chance to do a lot more hands-on learning. So we have specimens available so that they can kind of see and feel the things that they saw online as they learn how to ID the invasive species from some native lookalikes. And they'll get a chance to run through some scenarios, ask questions to their instructors. There will be people from DNR available at all the meetings. They can get some one-on-one time with DNR and ask specific questions to them as well, and the AIS specialist that'll be relying on them for some help throughout the way.
And whereabouts in the state are these training programs taking place?
Sure. So, of course, online, you can take that from anywhere, and that's the first step. Once you've completed your online training, we have 7 different locations across the state where you can attend your in-person workshop. Those are in Andover, Alexandria, Grand Rapids, Bemidji, Brainerd, Mankato, and Detroit Lakes.
What specific aquatic invasive species are the volunteers looking for?
So for plants, we are looking for Eurasian water milfoil, hydrilla, and starry stonewort. In the invertebrates group, we're looking for spiny water flea, rusty crayfish, zebra mussels, and quagga mussels. And in the fish group, we're looking for big head carp, silver carp, round goby, and ruff.
Do you have a goal for how many citizen scientists you'll bring into the program and train?
Yeah, so at least for this very first year, we have the 7 open groups, and if I can do some fast math at 25 apiece, that means that we'll have 175 detectors by the end of this year. As far as growth from there, we'd love to see people continue to add in. I don't know that we have a cap right now of where we would end people being able to join. So.
How do the aquatic invasive species detectors and trackers help fight against invasive species? What data specifically do they provide for researchers?
So the detectors, the big data that they're providing is where there's new detections. And they do have other things that they can do that's outside of maybe that citizen science and data collection realm. But having that information on where they're responding to reports, where they're finding things, is really important for us to know kind of how the spread might be happening, where they're located, and also, like I mentioned before, that's how you have your best chance at preventing something from getting established, by having that very first entry data point. The Trackers program, that data goes towards helping us learn more about what control tools are best suited for certain situations. So it might be the water chemistry of your lake, it might be the time of year and the species that you're treating. Anything like that is what we're hoping to learn out of the Trackers program.
Besides the detector and the tracker citizen science programs, how else is the Minnesota Aquatic Invasive Species Research Center helping to combat these species?
Sure. So the Minnesota Aquatic Invasive Species Research Center has a whole suite of researchers that are looking at topics from zebra mussels to invasive plants to fish and pathogens, so kind of this whole suite of potential invaders. And they're doing all kinds of really interesting projects that look at anything from how we might stop carp from coming up the Mississippi River to the pathways that zebra mussels might spread, and looking at the genetics of that to kind of get an idea of what lakes might be contributing to that. So there's a lot of great information all the way from the data that leads us to what kind of prevention we need to do to on-the-ground prevention activities.
How can we help prevent the spread of aquatic invasive species? When Access Minnesota returns, more from Megan Weber, an extension educator from the University of Minnesota's Minnesota Aquatic Invasive Species Research Center.
Access Minnesota will return after these messages. You're watching Access Minnesota. Here's Jim Dubois.
Back to our conversations on aquatic invasive species and how citizens can help researchers track important data from local waters. For Minnesotans who can't train to become a detector or tracker, how could they help combat aquatic invasive species, or at least be sure not to contribute further to the problem?
Sure. So there's lots of great tools that you can use and steps to help prevent from spread if you like to go out and enjoy Minnesota's lakes and rivers. We would recommend that if you are moving a boat or a dock or anything else out of one water body to another, to make sure that you're following the guidelines that are set out by Minnesota DNR. So you need to be sure that you're draining your boat. You shouldn't have like your boat plug in place when you're traveling over public roadways. Docks need to be out of the water for 21 days before they're transported to a new lake. And also there's lots of great resources online where if you wanted to learn more about how to do your own identification, you can learn what these species look like and keep your eye out for them. And if you see anything suspicious, be sure you report it to DNR.
What more do we need to do in order to protect our waters from invasive species?
I think it's just a matter of continuing to be aware and, of course, getting involved. Becoming a AIS detector is a great way to help. But I think as education continues to spread, we continue to see improvement on the activities that people are doing that are high-risk behavior. So talking to your neighbors about not moving water in your boat or not dumping bait that's been in one water body into another, being sure that you dispose your bait in the trash are all great ways to help prevent the spread of aquatic invasive species. So I think as you just continue to talk and use the resources that we have available, there's lots of great information online that will help.
And Megan, can you show us some examples of the training materials you use to help people identify aquatic invasive species?
Sure, I can. So I've brought with me a couple examples of some aquatic plants. So you can see from these two that they actually look a lot alike. So this is one of the things that detectors will learn how to tell the difference from. And one of these plants are native and belong in our waters, and one is invasive. So the one that I'm holding here, this is our native milfoil. This is called northern water milfoil. And one of the big keys to learning how to ID this plant comes when you count along. This is called a leaf here, and then each of these spikes is a leaflet. And on the native milfoil, you usually have less than 12 pairs of leaflets along a leaf. So you just count along these, and if you have less than 12, then you likely have a native species. Whereas when you look at the invasive, they usually have more than 12, say 12 to 20 of these leaflet pairs. So you'd count down a leaf again, and if you find a higher count of the leaflets, then you likely have an invasive species, and that's something that you want to report. And I also have here some examples of zebra mussels. These are a number of mussels that have attached themselves to a stick. And some of the ways that we can tell that it's a zebra mussel are that it has kind of this flattened edge that it attaches with. You can kind of see on the stick there's some spots where there's these threads that are poking out. That's what the mussel uses to attach on. So our native mussels don't attach on to like sticks or boats or anything like that. So that's one of the big things. If you find something that's attached onto something, there's a chance that it's a zebra mussel. They also have this very striped pattern across their shell. With zebra mussels, you often see some zigzagging to it.
Megan Weber is an extension educator at the University of Minnesota's Aquatic Invasive Species Research Center. Megan, thanks so much for joining us on Access Minnesota.
Great, thank you.
That's all for this month's edition of Access Minnesota. We'll see you again next month. Thanks for watching.
Access Minnesota. Issues that matter to you. Join us again next week as we bring you the newsmakers and stories that shape our everyday lives. Access Minnesota is produced by the Minnesota Broadcasters Association in cooperation with the University of Minnesota's College of Liberal Arts.
My name is Michael Goldman, and I teach in global studies and sociology.
I'm Catherine Pearson, an associate professor of political science.
My name is Hakim Abdurazak. I teach in the Department of French and Italian.
I'm Kat Hayes, and I teach in the departments of Anthropology and American Indian Studies.
My current research looks at this compulsion of countries to build global cities, so that places like Shanghai and Dubai are driven to outcompete each other, building lavish and expensive infrastructure that ultimately the people cannot afford. Now, this has implications for urban planners worldwide who are trying to figure out how to make city life less, not more difficult for the urban majority.
My recently published book, Party Discipline in the U.S. House of Representatives, shows that since 1987, party leaders have considerable power over the careers of their members of Congress, and that they reward loyal partisans with better committee assignments and more legislative opportunities on the House floor. This research is important because it shows that members of Congress have incentives to support their party leaders, sometimes at the expense of their constituents, and often to the detriment of working with members of the other party when they need to come together to solve the nation's most pressing policy problems.
I just published a book entitled Eccentric Migrations, Europe and the Maghreb in Mediterranean Cinema, Literature, and Music. My research is crucial in that it looks at less studied human migratory patterns from North Africa and the Middle East, such as the current refugee crisis, which has had unprecedented global impacts. This work has influenced my own artistic expression, an example of which is this painting, which is also on the book's cover.
I received a Talley Family faculty grant to research states of incarceration here at the military site of Fort Snelling in Minnesota. I hope that this work will provide a comparative perspective and help us to rethink our attitudes towards mass incarceration today.